joining us today.
Yeah.
We are going to talk a little bit about title. So would you tell us a little bit more about yourself and about where you work at Land Title?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Sglenn, obviously. I am a sales rep for Land Title all over the metro area, and I've been with them for 9 years now. So it's my first job out of college that I was able to get set up with. So our job is, to make sure that when people are buying and selling property, that they are protected, that there's nothing going on with the property or against the property that is going to be a surprise to a new buyer, right? So Land Title specifically is a Colorado-based company. We only do business in Colorado, and we've been around for over 50 years. And so we have this amazing opportunity to work with 25% of the buyers and sellers in Colorado. So whether you're buying property or selling property, chances are that we may be working together. And like I mentioned, it's really our job to make sure that everything goes smoothly and correctly during the closing process. So a lot of that process is still very antiquated and is still susceptible to a lot of human error. Mistakes that can happen during that process are as small as someone's name being misspelled or the wrong middle initial on a deed. Or it can be as big as someone forgot to pay off a mortgage and forgot to release it, and now there's 2 mortgages against a property, and buyers freak out. They're like, oh my God, I'm responsible for 2 mortgages. So we're here to protect anything during the transaction that does not clean the slate for the buyer so that they have full enjoyment to the property.
Awesome. Wow, that's great. Land Title, gotta love Colorado business.
I know, Colorado biz. Yeah, support local businesses, right?
Great. Well, thank you for joining us again, and well, let's dive into it.
Okay, sounds good.
My first question for you, Sam, is when a buyer goes under contract to purchase a home, how does title fit into this process?
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, title insurance is not something that's super well known, right? It's not something that we're taught about in high school or is really common knowledge. So I can understand how it's kind of a confusing process to be a part of, right? So what happens is as soon as a buyer goes under contract, the contract is sent over to us. And one of the first things that a buyer is going to have with us as an interaction is turning in earnest money. So that's typically 48 to 72 hours after going under contract. They're going to turn in earnest money as their good faith deposit, right? To show the sellers that they really have a vested interest and now a financial interest in going through with the sale of this property. So as a neutral third party, we hold that for all parties until we are told to do otherwise, right? Either that will be applied to cash to close at the end of the transaction, or if things terminate, we decide if that goes to the buyer or the seller.
Okay.
So once earnest money deadline happens, the next kind of big deadline will be record title deadline. So that's when we need to have all of our information and search out to the buyer so that they can really make an educated decision on if this property is going to be a good fit for them. So our title examiners search the property and see what's currently against it, right? What have the sellers taken out and what's currently against this property that we don't want the buyers to inherit as their own problem and their own responsibility, right? So that could be things like there's currently a mortgage out on the property, or there could be tax liens, mechanic liens, HOA liens, all of these things that we don't want them to take responsibility for, right? So it's our job to disclose all of those items and to work with everyone to get those cleared up so that when the buyer takes ownership of the property, it's a clean slate and they don't have to worry about any of those things that previous owners did. And if we did miss anything or something didn't get cleared, they then have an insurance policy with us to come back and say, hey, something's not right. Someone is telling me that they have an ownership in my property that I wasn't made aware of, or they have a lien against my property and are asking for payment. They can come back to us for that. So that's a really important piece of the title commitment, as well as looking at our exceptions to the title insurance policy and the commitment, because it's also important for the buyers to understand what's not going to be covered in their policy and really what they need to be aware of about the property that may or may not be a good fit for them. So for example, all the HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions, right? So those big documents about how the HOA was set up. Can you paint your house pink? Can you put a pool in the backyard? Can you have a dog over 50 pounds? All of that information is going to be in those documents. So it's really laborious, but it's important to read those and to make sure that they are going to be able to use this property how they want. I have a great example of this. So we had a situation where a buyer came back to us and said, hey, I can't park my company vehicle in my driveway, and I wasn't made aware that anyone told me that I couldn't do this. This was, a blue collar person who always parked their work vehicle in the driveway because it couldn't fit into the garage.
Yeah.
And they were told, hey, no one ever told me that I couldn't park this in the driveway. Well, it was in those covenants, conditions, and restrictions, that like 300-page document, and they hadn't read through it, and so he didn't know that he was buying a property that he wasn't going to be able to use fully. But that's where all of that information is disclosed to you as a buyer, and so it's important to read through and understand. Other things that could be in there are, utility easements. You could have a cable line, or, a water sewer pipe going through your backyard, or, it could talk about where your mineral rights were severed from the property. So there's a lot of different things that are included in there. And if you have any questions, ask, right? And pull things in, because this is a huge financial investment, one of the biggest ones we'll ever make in our life, right? And so make sure that you're comfortable, ask questions. Like I said, this is not common knowledge things that are included in the process. So really make sure that you're well educated and that you know what you're getting yourself into with this property, and that it's a great fit. So from that point, we work with the current lender that you are going to be working with to close on the property, get all of their documents, all of their fees together. You'll come to our office for closing day. We'll pop champagne and take closing pictures. And then if anything were to happen, like I said, you can come back to us. We're going to be able to, protect you and protect that investment that you're making into that property. So that's how we fit into things.
I love it. Yes. And I think it's also good to note as well that your realtor should be helping you throughout this process as well, especially with HOA docs. That is,
absolutely.
As a realtor myself, that is something I always do. I read through those docs because I'm the one that sees it.
Totally.
And so,
Madison, you would be amazed how many agents don't even open the title commitment, don't even look at it, don't even know what it is. And it's hard because we're not experts in every field, right? But you need to know when to ask questions, when things are unusual for a transaction, and maybe when your buyer should be taking a second look, because they've told you about their desires for the property and how they want to use it. And so you'll have a great idea, but everyone needs to do their due diligence, right?
Exactly. And no question is a dumb question, because most of my clients, they're probably gonna purchase a home maybe twice in their life, maybe 3 times. So you don't do it that often.
No.
So it's okay to ask questions and have concerns when you see something that you don't recognize.
Totally. Even people who are on their second, third, fourth, whatever property always have questions going through it again, because it's always not the same as the previous process too. Laws have changed, regulations have changed, software has changed, and now you're able to go into a portal. So it's always going to be a new experience every time. So even if you're not a first-time home buyer, don't be afraid to ask questions.
Absolutely. I do get a question a lot of when my buyers submit their earnest money, they're always curious, where it goes, who holds it, will they ever get it back? Things like that.
Good question. And we get a lot of questions too about how you can turn earnest money in, right? Like in what forms and what payments. So you'll come to one of our offices, and there are 2 forms that we can accept earnest money in. It can either be a personal check or a cashier's check. If you're unable to come to an office, you can also do a wire, but there's some things around that you want to be careful with. Or we also have an earnest money app. So there's additional options, but if you're not physically coming into one of our offices, you're probably going to get charged a fee, either a wired fee from your bank or a fee through going through the earnest money app as well. So there are remote options, but plan on coming into any land title office across the state, dropping off either a personal check or a cashier's check for that money. It's important to realize that that money is truly going to clear your account. I get asked all the time, are you guys just holding the check and then, you'll cash it at closing? And it's like, no, that will leave your account and that will be held in our bank account as, again, a neutral third party. So we're just here to make sure that the money is safe and that it's kept during the transaction. And then depending on how things go with the transaction depends on what happens with earnest money. So if all goes to plan, the earnest money will just be applied to the buyer's cash to close at the end. So if you owe $10,000 in cash to close and you turned in $5,000 worth of earnest money, you're only going to have to show up to closing with that other $5,000, right? You'll get an entire debit and credit sheet showing you exactly what your fees are and what you've already paid, and therefore what you'll need to bring to the table on the day of closing. If something happens during the transaction where the contract needs to terminate, that's where things can get a little wonky with how earnest money is held. And I'm sure you know this, but depending on how the contract terminates, when it terminates, and whether it's a time where, the buyer is essentially allowed to terminate, or if they're terminating outside of that, can depend on what happens with the earnest money. And we will hold the earnest money until there is a unanimous decision on who is getting that earnest money back, because sometimes the sellers do get the earnest money, or sometimes the buyers just get it back, or sometimes parties can't agree and they go to mediation for the dispute, right? But either way, again, we're a neutral third party. So until we get either a decree from the court telling us what to do, or all parties agree, then we are just going to hold it safe until we know exactly what needs to happen with that.
Okay, makes sense. Since we are on the topic of funds, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what buyers can expect at the closing table.
Yeah, so good question. So one of the biggest questions we get is, how do I know exactly how much money to bring on closing day, right? We will tell you down to the cents what you will need to bring. And if you are taking a loan out on the property, we'll coordinate with your lender too, to make sure that our fees coordinate with their fees, to give you an exact amount from both of us on what you'll need on closing day. So as a buyer, you'll get that number like anywhere 3 to 5 business days before closing, so that you know exactly what needs to happen. So funds are a little bit different with how you can bring them to closing. Colorado is what's called a good funds state. So a personal check or a briefcase of cash is not going to do it, right? So you're going to have to either wire the money, and we can talk about the best and safest ways to do that. If you are working with a lender, we could also take a cashier's check, since the majority of the money from the lender will be coming via wire. So if you do choose to wire, it's important to keep in mind that wire fraud is incredibly prevalent in our industry. And more than likely, a buyer will be reached out to by a fraudster saying, "Hey, I'm Sam with Land Title," with a spoofed email address, "and I know that you need to bring in exactly $987.16. So our wiring instructions have changed. So just go ahead and send that money over here." And because we're such high dollar amount transactions, they feel like it's really easy to pick off people and to have their money go somewhere else. Well, these are people's life savings that they're losing because of this. So the safest way to do it is to make sure that when you drop off earnest money, you get a hard copy of our wiring instructions. If we don't see you in an office, make sure that you only receive those wiring instructions via a secure email. It's a little annoying to go through the process, but I promise it's for good reason. It's because otherwise, fraudsters can sit in the background of our emails, and they will look for emails about wiring instructions, and they will change the wiring instructions to their wiring and their bank account, and it will look like it came from a trusted source like me or their closer or whoever. And so when in doubt, pick up the phone and call your closing team and say, "Hey, I just want to confirm before I initiate this wire, is this going to the right place? Is this your bank account? Is this your routing number?" so that we can make sure that those funds are safe. If you're ever concerned, give us a call. So that's the best practices for bringing your funds to closing. Other expectations on closing day: please make sure that you bring at least one form of ID. So driver's license, passport, state issued ID. Some lenders also require a second form of ID. A lot of times that can be, a lesser form. It doesn't have to be another state or government issued ID. It can be a Costco card or a health insurance card or a credit card, just anything with their name on it. So keep that in mind depending on the lender that you're working with. And then at closing, typically if a buyer is taking out a loan on the property, you can expect closing time to take between 30 and 45 minutes. So carve out that time on moving day during chaos to come to our office and to do that. And then some lenders have what's called funding conditions. And what that means is that after everything is signed, we're gonna have to send all the closing documents over to the lender for their approval before we can hand keys over. And so depending on, what time of day it is, if their processor's at lunch, if people are looking for the email, that can take some time on top of that. So have the conversation with your lender ahead of time to say, "Hey, do you have funding conditions? Because we've got a moving truck coming to the property and we need to go," and to kind of plan that day, because it is just going to be chaos on moving day and on closing day. So make sure that you account for that. Not a big deal if they do have funding conditions, but just work that into your timeline for things, because until the lender says that we have the okay, we cannot hand over keys. So nothing else will be happening at that point. You can go grab lunch, refuel, and then come back and grab the keys once we have the approval. And then once closing happens, You'll celebrate with your realtor, post pictures, pop champagne, and then it's not until 30 days after that you'll get your final title policy. So you'll receive that in an email and in the mail, which is your policy just letting you know, hey, if anything happens, this is your documentation. Keep it in a safe place. Download all of your closing documents. Put it into your hard drive somewhere safe. And then hopefully we get to see you on your next transaction when you go to sell, right?
Yes, exactly. Woohoo! When you're at the closing table, obviously lots of excitement is happening.
Yes.
Lots of documents also get brought to the closing table.
Oh my gosh, like a stack that
Huge
thick.
stack. So is there any advice or anything you can go into on certain closing docs that these buyers might see?
Yeah, so there are kind of a few key closing docs to keep your eye out for. The good news is that the person who's sitting with you at the table, who is part of the title company, their role is called a closer. So the closer is really going to walk the buyer through every single document so that they understand what it says. They're making sure all the information on it is accurate before they sign anything. So you're really going to have that personalized experience with them at the table. But a few key documents to keep your eyes out for are the bill of sale. So the bill of sale has all of the information about what's included with the property. We always say if you were to dump it out and things were to fall out of it, right? So anything that's included that's not affixed to a wall, right? So that would be things like appliances and hot tubs and, you know, whatever is included on the contract as inclusions that Madison negotiated for you guys during the deal. We want to make sure that all of that is reflected over and that there isn't anything on the moving truck that's not supposed to be there, which happens frequently. You know, sometimes people just bought a brand new refrigerator, so the sellers are like, oh, I want to take the refrigerator with me, right? And or the buyers thought the refrigerator was going to be there and now they're moving into a home without one. So it's a good kind of double check of, hey, what's on the moving truck, what's being included with the property, and is all of that information correct? So that's the bill of sale. That's a big one. The other one is the type of deed. And so there's several different types of deeds, but making sure that everyone's names on that are spelled correctly, because that's the document that gets recorded with the county that officially changes the record of who is the owner of the property. And so it's important, you know, sellers are the only ones who sign that document, but we always give it to buyers to make sure that their tenancy is correct and the type of deed is what they expected it to be. Two important lending documents that you can expect to see are going to be the promissory note. So if you are taking a loan out on the property, the lender's going to have a promissory note that's basically your promise to pay back the loan and the terms around that. So what your interest rate is, what the maturation date is, what the loan amount is. So that gets filed with the public trustee as your promissory note. So that's a really big one. Okay. The other one is going to be the deed of trust. So that's, again, another document that gets recorded with the county. That's what puts the lien against the property. And so, again, important that all of that information is disclosed, all the information is accurate on there. Buyers will sign that, yes, they agree to all the terms and conditions for the loan, that their lender has gone over with them ahead of time. And then that will get recorded with the county afterwards. One other document that's critical to look at is the settlement statement. The settlement statement is, like we were talking about, funds to closing. This is going to be all of the debits and credits throughout the transaction that talk about the bottom line that is due at closing. So that's going to be given to them ahead of time so that they know exactly what to show up with at the closing table. That's not a surprise, yes. But that's also going to make sure that everything is correct and paid for, right? Sometimes the sellers are giving the buyers a concession for a rate buy down or something like that. We want to make sure that that money is getting moved over to them. It talks about property tax prorations and HOA prorations and what the lender is providing them with both the loan amounts as well as the lender fees. So you want to make sure that all of that information is correct, and your agent, Madison, is going to be double checking all of that too to make sure that everything looks correct. Yes. But we need everyone's eyes to make sure that there isn't anything missed.
Yes, more eyes on it, the
yes.
the better chance you have of catching any mistakes.
Totally, because it happens, right? And that's exactly why you're getting title insurance, is that if something is missed, if there is something, you know, that wasn't handled correctly or wasn't clear, you now have protection from that, right?
Exactly. I remember you touching on types of deeds and tenancies, so could you explain to our buyers a little bit more on the details of those two topics?
Yeah, great question. So when you guys go under contract, part of the negotiation piece is going to be what type of deed is going to be used. And the two most common are a general warranty deed and a special warranty deed. There's always a lot of confusion and a lot of kind of fuss around the deed type. So the difference between the two is basically the amount of time frame that the seller is on the hook for in terms of what they're warranting. And they're warranting that they own the property, that the property is free and clear, and that the buyers will have full enjoyment to the property. So for a special warranty deed, that's limited to just the time that the sellers own the property. For a general warranty deed, those warranties are warranted for the entire lifespan of the property. So there's always this kind of pull and tug about, well, sellers are always going to want a special warranty deed and buyers are always going to want a general warranty deed, right? Because sellers don't want to be on the hook for anything more than what they're responsible for, and buyers want protection for the entire duration. So there's always a little bit of, like I said, pull and tug about it, and it's a great negotiation piece when you're going under contract. But the good news is that if the sellers are providing you a title insurance policy, all of those things are going to be covered for the entire lifespan of the property. So we have to remember that the deeds were recorded with the thought that title insurance is optional, right? It does not have to be included during the process. There are for sale by owner transactions where they just sign a deed and turn it into the county, and that's all that's done. And there is no due diligence. There is no making sure that they didn't take a loan out on the property, or that their neighbor's fence wasn't encroaching on the property, or anything like that, right? So we have to remember that if the sellers are offering you as the buyer a title insurance policy, you are getting way more coverage than what either of those deeds will offer. So not something to die on the hill with in terms of negotiations. You're going to be well covered by your title insurance policy, so long as you're using land title.
Right? Yes. Use land title.
Yes. In terms of tenancy, that's a really important decision to think about if you are going and purchasing a property with someone else. So let's say that you and I are going to buy an investment property together, as savvy people do, right? So let's say that we're going to go in on it together, but Madison and I have no familial relation. And so if I pass, I don't want my 50% portion of the property to go automatically to you, right? I want it to go to my family and to my heirs. Yes. If that was the situation, we would want to do tenancy in common, right? That would say that if one of us passed away, our portion of the property would go to our estate. It wouldn't automatically get transferred between the two of us, right? It wouldn't automatically all go to you. So let's say that you're buying a property with a husband, wife, or a significant other, where if you were to pass, you would want all of the property to go to them, right? Or maybe you're buying with a sibling and you're like, hey, we are the same family. I would want all the property to go to you if I did pass. So that's a really big decision to make. And there's no right or wrong answer, but just know that the default in Colorado is tenants in common. So if you do not specify joint tenants, then you are each going to own your separate portions, and then it will go to your estate if you pass. And that can be a really tough lesson to learn if after your husband or wife passes and you expected that, okay, now the house is fully mine, and it's not. That 50% has to go to probate, and you have to go through the probate courts and get 50% of your property back. That's not a super fun process. And so if you have questions about, tenancy and what's currently being held, talk to Madison and she can come talk to me and we can get a copy of your deed pulled to make sure that you have the right tenancy. But that's something really important to consider based on, again, what your intentions with the property are. How are you buying this? Why are you buying this? Who are you buying it with? And so, you've got great options.
Yes. And the way you select that type of tenancy is through your contract that
Correct.
You initially start with your realtor. So.
Yep. So you'll have that conversation with them, and then we'll take that exact information and copy and paste it onto the deed, so that again it's public record of what's been chosen between these people if anything were to happen and one of the owners were to pass.
Yes. Awesome. Great information.
Thanks. Happy to help. This is, like we talked about, this is a really confusing process. And so, you're going to want strong partners in the situation. And you guys are so lucky to have Maddie to be able to help and advise you along the way, because it's super complicated and nuanced. And you want to make sure that you have advocates in your corner who can help during these transactions.
Absolutely. I agree. Yes. And we use land title here at Supreme Realty Group. Our brokerage has been around for over 20 years, and I don't think we've strayed.
I don't think so either. I haven't been around that long. We haven't been around that long, but word on the street is that no,
word on the street.
We have an amazing partnership together, and so if there are any questions, we're able to pass them back and forth between each other and make sure that you have the best answers and the best advocates in your corner.
Woohoo!
Woohoo! Team SRG.
Yes, right? Cheers, Sam. Thank you so much, Sam, for coming in and explaining the title world to us, especially for first-time home buyers that might not have had an idea about how the process works. So you give us a lot of great information today. And if anyone has any other questions for Sam, I will have her contact information in the comments, and you can feel free to reach out to her or reach out to me.
Sounds awesome. Thanks for having me.
Of course.